Italy, 1945. The church bells no longer rang. The streets, once filled with voices and trade, were now covered in dust, rubble, and a silence that felt almost sacred. The sky turned red every afternoon, as if bleeding with the earth. Amid the destruction, an old abandoned school had been turned into a field hospital. Improvised beds, worn-out sheets, bottles of morphine counted drop by drop. The air smelled of sweat, blood, smoke, and something harder to name, weariness. That's where Claire Moreau worked. Young, with delicate features and eyes that had seen too much, she had become a nurse more out of necessity than calling. But her hands knew how to care, and her presence, calm even in the midst of screams, had become a silent comfort for many who would never return home. One morning, among the wounded brought in on a military truck, there he was, James Carter, an American soldier with a deep wound on his side and a raging fever. He didn't speak Italian. Claire barely understood English. But when their eyes met for the first time, something between them needed no translation. It wasn't a magical instant. It wasn't love at first sight. It was a pause. As if time, for a brief second, wanted to breathe. He could barely speak. She didn't know how to communicate. And yet, something began there, between bandages and sleepless nights, between shy gestures, exchanged glances, and shared silences. In the middle of a war where everything seemed to collapse, something was being born that defied the end. A thin rain slid down the broken tiles of the old school building. Inside, the steady dripping mixed with the sound of hurried footsteps, muffled groans, and barked orders in raspy voices. It was like this every day, every night. Claire tightened the ties of her apron. Another morning, another full day of dressing wounds, makeshift sutures, and hope measured in drops. Cot 7, high fever. American, said another nurse, handing her a clipboard. She simply nodded. She didn't ask for a name. She had learned it was better to discover that part later. The man on cot 7 had his eyes shut and skin far too warm. The wound on his right side had been poorly stitched and showed signs of infection. Claire bit her lip at the sight of the swelling. "You're going to be a handful, aren't you?" She whispered in Italian. She moved carefully, warmed some water, prepared the antiseptic, and began cleaning the wound. At every touch, his body flinched. But there was no strength in the movement, only pain and fever. "Easy," she murmured gently, wiping the sweat from his brow. "It'll be over soon." By the third gauze change, he opened his eyes, clear, hazy with pain, but alert. "Where am I?" he mumbled weakly. Claire paused for a moment. English. She only knew a few words. "Hospital, you hurt," she said with a heavy accent, gesturing with her hands. He blinked slowly as if trying to remember something. "You... nurse?" She pointed to herself. "Claire..." He closed his eyes again. "James," he murmured. "James Carter." That was all they said that day. But that night, after her shift, as she passed the rows of cots one last time, Claire paused at cot 7. He was asleep, breathing with difficulty. She adjusted the sheet in silence, and before she walked away, she whispered, "Good night, James." She didn't expect a reply, but from between sleep and fever, he mumbled, "Claire." It was the first time someone had spoken her name with tenderness in a very long time. In the days that followed, the rain ceased, but inside the hospital, the sky still felt grey. New wounded arrived daily, brought in by truck, some still screaming, others too weak even for that. On cot 7, James held on. The fever rose and fell. The trembling eased, and his eyes grew more focused each day, watching everything around him with a mixture of curiosity and exhaustion. Claire passed by him every morning right on time, with her metal cart, fresh bandages, and steady gaze. She already knew where. He felt more pain, which side he avoided moving, and that he hated the watery soup served at noon. "You're picky, even half dead," she'd joke in Italian. Smiling, he didn't understand, but he smiled back. One afternoon, she sat beside his cot and handed him a folded piece of paper. Inside were drawn little figures: a house, a flower, a plate of bread, a cloud. James looked at her, puzzled. "You speak English, Little," she explained, pointing at the drawings. He smiled, understood. He pointed at the flower. "Flower," Claire repeated, slightly embarrassed. "Flower," he laughed, soft but genuine. "Close. Enough." From that moment on, they invented their own language. Broken words, drawings, gestures, long glances, small things that carried more weight than they seemed. In the absence of words, there was presence, and sometimes that said more than full sentences. In one of the quietest nights, Claire was doing rounds when she heard a soft sound coming from cot 7. James was turning restlessly, sweating, mumbling words in English she didn't understand. But she recognized the tone: fear. She approached and gently touched his shoulder. "Shh. It's okay. You're safe." He opened his eyes, startled. His breath was fast. Claire pulled up a chair and sat beside him, saying nothing more. She just stayed. Time passed, and when his eyes finally closed again, she whispered, unsure if he could understand, "I'm here." That night she realized James was no longer just the man on cot 7. He was a silence she missed when he wasn't there. The cold was finally giving way. The sun appeared timidly behind the clouds, and for the first time in weeks, some windows in the hospital were opened. The spring air drifted in slowly, mixing with the ever-present smells of antiseptic and metal. James could now sit up on his own. The wound still ached, but his eyes were sharper. He had started speaking with other soldiers, brief phrases, tired jokes, the kind that try to hide how fragile everyone really feels. Claire noticed and pretended not to. One afternoon, after her shift, she entered the small storeroom where they kept supplies. It was cold in there. She took a tin mug, warmed water, and brewed some tea. She was about to leave, but paused. She turned back. Made another mug. She walked over to cot 7. "Tea," she said, showing the cup. "Ah, cha, for you." James smiled, surprised. He took the cup carefully. They sat there side by side, unhurried. They drank in silence. It was he who spoke first, pointing to a small sheet of paper on the nearby table. It was a rough map, with hand-drawn roads and borders. "My home," he said, pointing to a spot. "Georgia, USA." Claire leaned closer, trying to understand. He took a pencil and drew something next to it. A small house with trees around it. Then he pointed at her. "And you?" She hesitated, then smiled. She took the pencil and drew a heart where they were on the map. "Here," James laughed, and in that laugh there was something between pain and relief. In the days that followed, they began to share little routines. Claire would leave an extra piece of bread beside his tray. James drew clumsy sketches and left them near his pillow. Flowers, a cup of tea, a nurse with a sun-shaped face. One day, she found one of his sketches and slipped it into the pocket of her apron, without saying a word. But that same day, when she passed by him at the end of her shift, James reached out and held her hand for just a moment longer. No words were spoken, but both understood. In war, everything was noise, haste, and loss. But between them, there was quiet. There was pause. There was something no explosion could erase. The sound of planes had returned. For weeks, the town had lived in a tense calm, like the pause between two thunderclaps. But now, the rumble of engines was back, still distant, but undeniable. And with it came the old fear, reflected in soldiers' eyes, in hurried steps, in the way people stopped looking each other in the face. Claire felt it and feared what it meant. James could now walk with assistance. He had enough strength to leave his cot for a few minutes each day. On these brief outings, he went to the small stone courtyard of the hospital, where the sun gently touched the worn benches. There, he would sit and look up at the sky, perhaps hoping for answers. Claire began finding him there often. "Feeling better?" she'd ask, already knowing. "Better with you," he'd answer, his accent soft, a smile in his voice. She pretended not to understand, but she did. One day she brought him a gift, an old radio fixed by one of the doctors. It played mostly static and sometimes the faint signal of a French station, but it was enough. They sat together, listening to a distant melody. He looked at her, serious for the first time in days. "War's almost over." She nodded slowly. "Yes, almost." James took a deep breath. "I'll be gone soon." The words hung in the air. Claire folded her hands in her lap, looked straight ahead. She didn't say anything. He didn't insist. In war, love didn't ask for promises. It didn't ask questions. It just existed while it could. That night she struggled to fall asleep. She thought of the way he held the teacup in both hands, how he furrowed his brow, trying to understand her, how quiet he remained when she needed silence. She thought of everything they hadn't said, and deep down she knew they didn't need to. She knew, he knew, and that hurt even more than any confession. The news came early before sunrise. 3 soldiers from the hospital were being transferred to the front. A convoy would depart at noon. There would be little time for goodbyes. James was one of them. Claire heard the news behind her while preparing. A tray of gauze. She felt her entire body tense, but said nothing. She had learned, in war, you don't scream. He found her in the courtyard. He wore his uniform again, the same one he had arrived in. It was clean now, but worn. He looked taller, stronger, but his eyes, they were still soft and sad. "I have to go," he said, voice rough. She nodded, barely. "You are better now." He stepped closer. He wanted to touch her hand, but didn't know if he should. "I don't know if I'll come back." Claire swallowed hard. "I know." They stood there for long seconds. Neither knew what to say, and perhaps there was nothing left to say. She walked with him to the gate. Soldiers climbed into trucks. Engines roared. The scent of diesel mixed with dust. James stopped in front of her. He looked at her as if trying to memorize her face forever. "Claire." She interrupted with a gentle gesture, reached into her coat pocket and pulled something small. It was the map they had drawn together, folded carefully. Inside it, a button from his uniform, stitched into a blue cloth. "So you remember someone is waiting." He took the gift with trembling hands, pressed it to his chest. "Promise me." She nodded, eyes full. "I promise." When the truck drove away, Claire stayed behind. She didn't cry. She simply brought her hand to her lips and whispered softly, "Come back to me, James, even if it takes time, even if it hurts." The courtyard was empty again. The chair where James used to sit was now always cold. Mornings felt longer. Tea lost its taste. And the hospital returned to its usual rhythm. New patients arriving, some leaving, others lingering too long. Claire resumed her duties as before, but something inside her had shifted. Her steps were slower, her gaze more distant. Her hands still healed, but no longer felt. Days passed, then weeks. No letters, no word, no sign. She asked quietly now and then to doctors, sometimes to soldiers who returned wounded. "Tall American? James Carter?" Most just shook their heads. Some said they didn't know. Others avoided her eyes. One afternoon, while sorting through a fallen soldier's belongings, she found a crumpled note listing names of the injured. She read each line. Nothing. She climbed to the hospital's attic, a place she rarely visited, and sat among boxes of old uniforms. And there, on the dusty floor, she cried, not loudly, not with anger, but with the grief of someone mourning what may never return. In the days that followed, she tried to move forward. She placed the map they had drawn together inside a book, stored the blue cloth in a wooden box, began walking alone to the courtyard, sitting on the bench he used to occupy. She sat quietly, watching the sky, as he had done, perhaps trying to hear what he once heard. "He may be gone, Claire," said a fellow nurse one evening. "That's what war does. Some return, others become silence." Claire didn't answer, but that night before sleep she still whispered, "If you're alive, come back." And if he wasn't, at least he had taken with him the memory of her name. Autumn arrived without rush. Orange leaves covered the stones in the courtyard, and the wind carried the smell of damp soil. The hospital, now growing quiet, received fewer soldiers. The bombs sounded far away, like echoes from a nightmare nearing its end. But for Claire, the war wasn't over, not until he returned. That morning, a cardboard box arrived at the hospital. It wasn't unusual. Donations of clothes, books, and belongings left behind by American troops withdrawing were common. Claire helped organize without thinking much, until something caught her eye. An envelope, yellowed by time, with a name, written in firm English letters, "To Claire, Italy." She froze. Her heart pounded. She tore the paper carefully, as if a rough gesture might erase the words inside. Inside was a folded sheet of paper, handwritten in familiar script. "Claire, if you're reading this, it means someone, somewhere, fulfilled the promise I almost couldn't. I was wounded again. I thought I wouldn't make it. But before I lost consciousness, I asked a friend to deliver this letter. I told him, 'Take this to the Italian nurse, the one with the sad eyes and the bravest heart I've ever known. If I survive, I'll come back. If I don't, know that on the darkest nights, your voice kept me alive.' James." Claire's hands trembled. She sat in the nearest chair, closed her eyes. She didn't cry. She smiled, because now she knew he had tried to come back, and that was enough to wait a little longer. That night, she returned to the attic, took out the map, the cloth, and the little flower he had once drawn. She laid everything across the bed, and for the first time in months, she slept in peace. Because when there's a promise, even distance doesn't mean silence. It was an ordinary afternoon. The sun warmed the courtyard stones, and a few children played in the street beside the hospital, a sound that hadn't been heard in a long time. The war wasn't officially over, but the troops were retreating. Fear was fading. Life was beginning to peek through again. Claire was helping to organize files in the old office. The hospital was slowly emptying. Doctors were being transferred, cots dismantled, and she still didn't know what would come next. She heard footsteps near the entrance, probably more soldiers, or someone looking for information. But there was something different about those steps, measured, slow, as if each one carried intention. She didn't turn immediately, only when a voice, low, rough, almost shy, said, "Claire!" The world stopped. She turned slowly, hardly believing her ears, and there he was, James, thinner, a faint scar down one cheek, wearing civilian clothes now, a dark, worn coat, carrying a small pack slung over his shoulder, but the eyes were the same, the eyes she had never forgotten. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then she took a step, then another, and then she ran. He opened his arms. The embrace was firm, desperate, full of all the words they'd never said. She cried without shame. He held her like someone clinging to breath. "You came back," she whispered. "I promised, didn't I?" She looked into his eyes. "I waited. I knew you would." Later, they sat in the courtyard, on the same bench as always. Claire pulled the blue cloth from her pocket. James took the old map from his pack. Carefully folded, they placed them side by side on their laps and sat in silence, watching the sky change colors, this time without fear, without hurry, without war, just together. This was not a story of grand declarations. There were no dramatic speeches or tearful confessions under the rain. It was a story of silences, of glances that lingered, of hands that held on just long enough. Claire waited, not because she was naive, but because she was brave. James returned, not because he was lucky, but because love pulled him back. In a world torn apart by war, they found a stillness that endured. And sometimes, the quietest kind of love is the one that echoes forever. Did this story move you? Share your thoughts in the comments. We love hearing from you. Like the video so more people can discover this story of love and resilience. Subscribe to the channel to hear more powerful emotional narratives like this one. New stories every week, because here, love doesn't fade. It waits, it holds on, and it returns.